Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here today and to be part of this initiative to raise awareness about the need to avert a third world war and also to discuss the importance of adopting a new perspective towards Iran. I've titled my discussion, Rereading Iran, a friend rather than a foe. Will they or will they not attack Iran? This has been the question on everybody's mind over the past few months, as the mass media endlessly recycles the same fiction that Iran's enrichment program is really a cover for a nuclear weapons agenda. The frequently cited fears about the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran are that Tehran is months away from building a bomb or that it might use a nuclear weapon in a first strike against adversaries in the region. How well-founded are these fears, and to what extent are these fears of a nuclear Iran exaggerated? My central argument is that this mass hysteria is entirely unjustified and unwarranted, owing to the fact that hitherto the Islamic Republic of Iran has acted as a rational state actor. I argue that it is the irrational approach of the international community that has brought us to the brink of a third world war. The question is just who actually believes that Iran is building a bomb? Certainly not senior US officials, for they have repeatedly stressed that there is no substantive evidence that Iran has a clandestine weaponization program. In Senate testimony on the 31st of January of this year, James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, stated that American officials believed that there was no evidence that Iran had made a decision on making a concerted push to build a weapon. At the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Clapper concluded, "We don't believe they have actually made the decision to go ahead with a nuclear weapon." David Petraeus, the CIA director, concurred with that view at the same hearing. Other U.S. officials, including Defense Secretary Leon Panetta and General Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have made similar statements in various television appearances. Mohammed El-Baradei echoed these misgivings in his memoir, in which he states that he doubted that policymakers in Washington were ever truly interested in resolving the Iranian nuclear issue, that they sought instead to achieve regime change. Indeed, the idea that Iran is determined to build a weapon is intended to generate fear, and fear translates into justification for waging war on Iran. And waging war on Iran is not about destroying Iran's alleged nuclear facilities. It's about toppling the regime. And regime termination is not about democracy. We know all too well that the US only stands for democracy and human rights when and where it suits its interests. As His Excellency Ambassador Sheikh Attar explained, Iran had a democratically elected Prime Minister, Mossadegh, in 1953, who was overthrown by a US-orchestrated coup d'etat. Not to mention the fact that for 25 years the US supported the Shah, who was a dictator. In order to justify the egocentric, ethnocentric stance toward Iran, the West has reduced the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as an era of revolutionary revivalism with apocalyptic scenarios. The fact is that the West's behavior was no different during reformist Mohammad Khatami's presidency. This was a time when Iran offered the dialogue of civilizations discourse as an antidote to Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. It was a time when Iran made watershed diplomatic overtures towards the West, only to be branded as a member of an axis of evil with Iraq and North Korea. In 2007, the National Intelligence Estimate disclosed the groundbreaking report that Iran had halted its nuclear program in the autumn of 2003, representing the consensus view of 16 international U.S. intelligence agencies. The NIE tore up its previous assertions about Iran's nuclear ambitions and dismantled the myth that Iran is hell-bent on achieving regional domination through covert militarization. The report was a testament that Iranian leadership has a much more rational interest in self-preservation and pragmatism than the Western media has led the world to believe. Herein lies my central argument. We need to stop this drive towards a Third World War by adopting an entirely different paradigm in dealing with Iran. And I'm not speaking about the puzzle of Iran or the paradox of Iran or the rogue state or the pariah of Iran, but the Iran that is a pragmatic state actor that can contribute to the issues that are taking place, to resolving the issues, conflicts in the region. However, for the past 33 years, the dominant hegemonic powers have engaged in the same tired, old, exhausted campaign to vilify Iran. The tempo has stepped up over the years, but the general tone has been one of hostility and antagonism. Albert Einstein said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again whilst expecting different results. This is the case in dealing with Iran. Absolute insanity. The relentless campaign to ostracize Iran has only served to create further polarization, and conferences like this where we are discussing strategies to avert a possible Third World War. If the West wants different results, it needs to employ different methods. In order for the West to engage Iran more constructively, it needs to first deconstruct this caricature it has created of Iran since the 1979 revolution. And second, to reconstruct Iran as the rational state actor that it is. We can begin the deconstruction process by rereading Iran, by moving away from these depictions of a mad, messianic, revolutionary regime. Then we need to lay the parameters of a more integrative, a more constructive strategy of engaging Iran. I shall state a few facts here that can perhaps help us reconstruct our perceptions of Iran in a more accurate light. So far, the international community has only succeeded in conjuring up a nuclear boogeyman. By contaminating Iran's international image, the West is itself provoking a regional arms race. Proliferation begets proliferation, as does imagined or imaginary proliferation. Increasingly, regional countries are bracing themselves for the materialization of a monolithic nuclear giant, a caricature of Iran that the West has dangerously and irresponsibly drawn up. Fear and insecurity are factors that can actually drive states to develop deterrence capabilities of their own. The frequent and menacing provocations aimed at Iran have only intensified antagonism and resentment. Earlier this year, at the instigation of American lobbyists, the US government removed from its list of terrorist organizations the anti-Iranian opposition movement Mujahideen Khalq. The US had designated the MEK as terrorists as a result of killings they had carried out against Iranians and Americans. Another recent provocation was Congressman Dana Rohrabacher's nefarious resolution to divide Iran along ethnic lines. Congressman Rohrabacher is aware that playing on ethnic tensions is a recipe for the worst kinds of violence. In fact, the congressman has admitted that he supports the terrorist group MEK over peaceful opposition groups because of the Mujahideen's willingness to use force. Aside from other chronic threats like economic and cyber warfare and regime termination efforts, there are other strategic threats. The US bases its naval Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, which is only 150 miles from Iran. It has an aircraft carrier-led battle group in the Persian Gulf, as well as warplanes and thousands of troops stationed in Kuwait and Qatar. One analyst has said that in terms of provocation, this is roughly the equivalent to the Chinese basing a naval fleet in Havana, a battle group in the Caribbean, warplanes in Venezuela and Nicaragua, and troops in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Even against the background of a chorus of high-octane threats, Iran has said it will only engage militarily if it is attacked. Brigadier General Hossein Salami of the Revolutionary Guards recently said, "We will not start a war, but if someone wages war against us, we will launch continuous offensives." What's important to note here is the phrase, "we will not start a war." Even in the most irrational of circumstances, Iran speaks with a rational voice. After the barrage of existential threats and provocations issued at Iran over these past few years, It is almost irrational of Iran not to have withdrawn from the NPT by now. On the whole, Iran has demonstrated careful calculation and calibration in its foreign policy. It is not the fanatical regime depicted by the media. Iran has no record of military adventurism or aggression against any of its neighbors in modern history. And it has demonstrated a sophisticated level of diplomacy. Often national interests and strategic calculations have taken precedence over ideology. I can cite a couple examples. For example, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Iran sided with the Christian Armenians as opposed to the Muslim Azerbaijan. Or, for example, Iran remained relatively silent over the suppression of the Chechen Muslims in their conflict with Russia, stating that it was an internal Russian affair. And this just shows that Iran's strategic interests took precedence over ideology. So Iran is not a fanatical, zealously ideologically driven regime. Tehran has responded to inducements and pressures reasonably. So reasonably that despite the fact that the country is surrounded by nuclear powers, it has systematically denounced weapons of mass destruction. This can be explained by the fact that Iran is one of the first victims of biological and chemical warfare. As Ambassador Sheikh Attar mentioned, innocent Iranian civilians became victims of Saddam's greatest chemical experiment during the 1989 Iran-Iraq war. About 100,000 Iranians were affected by nerve and mustard gas, and thousands of victims that are still receiving treatment today, and hundreds are dying every year. So even though Iran was a victim of weapons of mass destruction, the father of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, unequivocally denounced non-conventional weapons. Iran has adhered to this policy ever since, and deviation would suggest an unthinkable departure from the fundamental tenets stipulated by the founder of the revolution. Iran's current supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has even issued a fatwa, a religious edict, declaring that the production, stockpiling, and use of nuclear weapons are all haram, which means prohibited by law in Islam. He said that there is no winner in a nuclear war, and entering a war is irrational and inhuman. However, all of these statements have fallen on deaf ears. Likewise, various conciliatory measures on Iran's part have gone unnoticed. For example, in a spirit of partnership and solidarity in the war against terror, Iran played a significant role in providing military and intelligence assistance to the Northern Alliance Afghan troops that succeeded in driving the Taliban out of Kabul in November 2001. At the Bonn talks that followed, U.S. Special Envoy to Afghanistan James Dobbins affirmed that Iran had played a decisive role in persuading the Northern Alliance delegation to form a government with the other opposition groups and to make sure that the wording of the interim constitution committed the Afghanis to building democracy and cooperating with the West in the war against international terrorism. Instead of seeing these occasions as a window of opportunity for rapprochement, the White House denied that Iran had made any significant contributions on the battlefield or at the Bonn talks. During his presidency, Mohammad Khatami tried to allay fears about Iran's nuclear dossier in a very voluntary fashion. In 2003, Tehran made a pledge of sustained transparency by volunteering to sign the additional protocol to the Non-Proliferation Treaty Safeguards Agreement, granting the IAEA inspectors greater authority in verifying the country's nuclear program and broader rights of access to sites in the country. Another overture was Iran's temporary suspension of the nuclear fuel cycle, deemed as voluntary and a temporary confidence-building measure under the Paris Agreement of 2004. None of these gestures were recognized by the international community. The US had another opportunity to normalize relations with Iran in June 2003, when Tehran made a sweeping offer addressing a whole range of issues dividing the two countries. The Swiss consulate transmitted the Iranian agenda for talks offering full transparency for security, that there are no Iranian endeavors to develop or possess WMDs, joint decisive action against terrorists, coordination on a stable Iraq, coordination on nuclear matters, the end of material support to Palestinian opposition groups, including Hamas and Jihad, resisting any opposition groups that were resisting Israeli occupation, and a normalization of relations. The Bush administration, however, feeling triumphant after the toppling of the Iraqi regime, did not even reply to what could have been a grand bargain. The moderate camp in Iran was disappointed, it was discredited as a result, and the snub generated a lot of resentment amongst more hardline elements and can explain why Iran's stance has even become harder during the years. There's a question of trust here and of goodwill. Even if a grand bargain could not have been achieved, certainly a limited one could have been achieved. I've tried to substantiate the claim that Iran, although a revolutionary and ideological entity, attempts to pursue a pragmatic foreign policy based on national and security interests. Thus, the West needs to reread Iran and to reconstruct Iran as a rational actor. Never before has the world needed a new logic of engagement for dealing with Iran. The West can no longer resort to coercion, to unilateralism, to effect change in the political arena, change that invariably reflects their interests and interests that have brought us to the brink of a thermonuclear war. It's high time the West tested Iran as a partner, as a friend rather than a foe, with a higher aim of preventing the looming humanitarian disaster. For this, a robust dialogue is required. However, we are all aware that dialogue is fraught with difficulties and possible derailments. The historical baggage in the Iran-US relationship is a major source of contention that has bred mistrust over the past 3 decades. These past grievances need to be aired out and put to rest. Even if the nuclear impasse is resolved, a bridge of trust needs to be built through meaningful dialogue. Most importantly, this dialogue needs to be free of prejudgment or the impulse to dominate, to threaten, to assimilate, or to coerce. Dialogue must take the form of a truly dialogical exchange based on goodwill, free from egocentrism and free from ethnocentrism. The road to improved relations will be rocky. However, the wall of mistrust must be torn down brick by brick before it becomes any denser. As a new paradigm, dialogue is a very small price to pay for possibly preventing the extinction of humankind. Thank you.